Hello everybody and welcome to week 13. This is ISTE 240 Web and Mobile 2, and today we are going to be enhancing our travel site. This is our individual project part 2. We are going to be adding some login functionality to our website. So before I get started, I want to give you a little bit of background of what our site should currently look like. I've based our code so far on that modular site done, and I think everybody else has hopefully been following along with that. Those done files are finished, but we added that database connectivity to it. And here is my PHP MyAdmin database, or my JXT ADM database, and currently I have 2 tables. Now for your individual project final, you're probably also going to want to have at least 2 tables and definitely a third. The first one we're going to need to have is the travel site comments table. Now I chose to put in comment text, a rating, and an author. Yours could look differently depending on what type of fields you're collecting. And we have the travel site pages. This is going to contain the pages for at least 2 of your web pages for the final project. Now in this case, I've stored the title, the text, but I've also kept things like the date and if they're published or not. I don't think I'm going to make it required to necessarily store, whether it's published or not, but you might want to put these things in there. And next we're going to be adding a database that contains user accounts for the website. Now before I start building the table, let's take a look at the workflow of how our login application is going to work. So first off, we're going to have a login form. This is going to behave just like any other form we've built. It's going to collect 2 bits of information. It's going to collect a username and a password. The username and password are going to be collected using the method of post, so they're not going to be sent over the URL. It's going to be sent behind the scenes in post. So the username and password is then going to be sent to a separate page called loginprocess.php. Now some of you might have already experimented with combining the processing and the form in one script. That's okay to do, but in this example I have 2 different scripts. I have the loginform.php or .html that collects this information, then it sends you with an action. So the action would be set to loginprocess.php. Now this script here is going to do our checking to see if we've provided valid credentials. Now in order for it to check if we have valid credentials, it's going to need to query the database, which we have over here. We're going to have a table in our database, which I'm going to call travel site users. For now, I'm just going to have 1 user, and that user is going to have a username and a password associated with it. Now this login process here, it's going to get the username that we've sent in from the form, and it's going to query the database. It's going to fetch the password that's associated with that specific username. Now we'll get into the specifics of how we can do this securely later on, but just imagine for now that the password is being pulled from the database into this PHP script, the correct password I should say, and then the password we give it in the form, or a user gives it in a form, is coming from over here. Now this script then needs to do a comparison. It needs to compare the value that the user has given it against the value that we know is correct from the database. Now if it hasn't provided a correct password, we're going to display some sort of error message. Maybe we want to give them the option to reset the password. But if they have given the correct password, so the passwords match, then we are going to create a session variable called valid user. Now we haven't talked much about sessions, but they're essentially a variable that we can set that are built upon cookies, and it's going to allow us to store a value that can be carried throughout several different PHP pages as long as the browser remains open. Once we close our browser completely, that session has been closed and we use those variables. So hopefully you're kind of thinking that this session would be a good thing to store the information about whether they are logged in or not. The nice thing is it can store that they've logged in, and as soon as they close out their browser, the session is lost and they're no longer treated as being logged in. This is why in a lot of web applications that you've used, you close the browser, you go back in, and you've been signed out. That's probably because the authentication was based upon a session. And the session variable, as long as the window stays open, is going to be stored for a certain amount of time. So we can go to multiple different pages and we can access that variable from multiple different pages without having to pass it over the URL. So this is going to be very useful, because then let's say we end up on this private page that only a member can see. We're going to put an extra layer of checking, possibly through an if statement, on this private page that goes and fetches this session variable called valid user and make sure we have it set, or make sure we have it set to be true. Now it's up to you guys how you want to name the variable and how you want to declare them as being successfully signed in or not, but this is just the overall principle that you would use. You would want to store some sort of placeholder or variable that's indicating that they've successfully signed in, that future sites can then fetch that variable to ensure that they are signed in. I've now gone back into phpMyAdmin, and I'm going to go ahead and create our third database table that stores the user information. Now I'd suggest you follow a similar pattern. If you haven't yet, that's okay. But in this case, I've given everything associated with my final project the prefix of travel site underscore. So we have comments, we have pages, and I am going to go down here to add a new table, which is, I can do it a couple different ways. I'm going to go into structure here, and I am going to, maybe I'm doing this wrong. I'm going to go back to JXT-ADM, I apologize, and I am going to create a new table. So I kind of went back to the top level of our database. I'm going to create a new table, and I'm going to call it travel site, and I'm going to call this one users. This is going to store all the information about our users. We could have one user, we could have hundreds of users, we could have no users, but this database is going to be flexible enough to store user information. And when I first start out my website, I'm just going to store very basic information. I'm just going to store the person's username and the person's correct password. Now, for your projects, you'll probably want to store more information. You might want to store their full name, or maybe you want to break it up so you store their first name and their last name. Maybe you store their address. Maybe you store where, how they learned about your site. There's going to be all sorts of information we can store, but I'm just going to start simple because I really want you guys to get the basic idea of this. Now, in future downstream courses, you will have to build a lot more complicated databases, but I want everybody to at least understand the basics of what's happening here. So I'm creating 2 columns, and I am going to click Go. And actually, I did want to create 3 columns, so let me go back here, and let's try that one more time. I am going to click here. I'm going to create 3. And I'm going to call it travel site users, and I'm going to give each user an ID. Like I mentioned before, most of our tables we want some sort of primary identifier that's going to be unique. Now eventually we probably would want to make the username unique, but for now I just want to keep things basic. I'm going to give this an ID, so each user will have an ID, and I'm going to set that to be auto increment by clicking that little checkbox all the way to the right, which will in turn make this a primary key. Next, I want to add a field for our username. This is going to be something like your RAT username. It's for my specific example, I'm not using email. You could use email if you'd like. I'm going to do a username like JXTADM without the email, but it's up to you how you guys want to handle that. I'm going to give this or make this a varchar, because we know, maybe it's 100 characters or less. And finally, I want to make a field that stores our password. Now, we'll see this in a little bit. We're not actually going to store their plain text password. That would be a security concern. We don't want to ever know a user's password in its actual English literal phrase. We want to disguise the password that the user gives us. This will make things a lot more secure, and it won't hopefully make our site vulnerable to if a site were hacked into. I'm going to call this password. I'm once again going to make it a varchar, but this one I'm going to be storing a long hashed password inside of it. So instead of what's that most popular password used, God or something like that. So instead of storing something like a 3-letter word or whatever our password requirements are, I'm going to store a long string that looks sort of like gibberish. So I'm going to use my TEMP-PWD as the password that I give to my user, and I'm going to run this through something that's going to hash that into an MD5. And you'll see when I click generate, this is what our hash actually looks like. So I'm not going to be storing this string as a password in the database. I'm going to be storing this hash. So that way it's more secure. If anybody were to ever get into here, they would never actually see your plain text English password. But as you can see, this is a number of characters, so I probably can set this to be, I'm going to set this to be 200 because maybe I'll add more security later on. And I'm going to go ahead and click save. So now we have all 3 of our tables. These are all 3 tables that you should need to have a successful individual final project. As I mentioned before, we have a comments table, we have a pages table, and a users table. Now we need to insert a user. We'll insert a user for ourselves so that we are able to eventually get into this authenticated part of the site. Now today I'm not going to demo how to build an actual registration system. I might cover that later on if we have time. For now, we're going to have to basically manually add our users in PHPMyAdmin, which I know in a working site wouldn't be a feasible solution in a product that we went to production with. But in this case, it's going to be okay. And as hopefully you guys remember, to add data to one of our tables in this graphical user interface, we're going to click Insert. I'm going to add somebody with the username JXTADM. And once again, I want to store their correct password in here. This is how when a user registers, it's going to eventually store it in here. But as I mentioned before, I don't want to store it in plain text. That's going to be a security problem. So what I've done is I'm going to use this MD5 hash generator. Now there's going to be more secure ways of doing this, but this will work for now. And I'll put the link out there for this. It's md5hashgenerator.com. And what you guys are going to need to go and do is think of a sample password that you want to use, and you're going to need to generate the hash code. Now I put a link out there in my courses and the additional resources that's going to explain a bit more about passwords and hashing and how we can do things one way but we can't hash things back the other way. I don't want to get into it too much, but I'd encourage you to watch this video. or to also just Google MD5 and you can read about it on your own. But let's get back to our hash generator. So I mentioned for my password that I want to use in my form to sign in with, I want to use just something general that we're going to remember. It's not very secure yet. We just need something to test with, so I'm going to use that TEMP PWD. I'm going to click generate, and that's going to give me this long hash. So this is what I'm going to want to store in our database. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go back to our insert, and I'm going to paste this in here, and I am going to click go. Now I'll come back to this and explain this a little bit, but you'll see this has generated the insert query here. So if we wanted to later on add a registration system, this is the insert query we would want to copy and paste and then substitute our values into in order to successfully save a person. But for now I said it's okay to just insert them manually. So I'm going to click browse, and you'll see we have one user. And basically I'm going to set up so the user who signs in has full access to do whatever they want. In a larger website, you probably would want to have different roles for your users. Maybe some people can delete items, some people can just go in and see things. But for now, we're just keeping things simple. So we've created our username in the database. Now the next step we'll probably want to do, and you don't need to do it exactly in this order, I'm just choosing to do it in this order, but we're going to go ahead and create a form, a very basic login form. So I'm going to go into CyberDuck here, and if you've been following along so far, you probably have a similar structure for your modular site. We have our index, and this is the one that can show every single page depending on what sort of argument we feed after it. We say like ID equals 1, ID equals 3, and so on. Then last week we added this page insert.php. This was a very simple form where we could submit content, and then I have a separate processing form that handles the inserting of content. And this was just a leftover example when I was initially trying to test inserting content. I'm going to go ahead here, do new file, and we're going to call it just login.php. So this is going to be our login form. And while I'm at it, I can go ahead and also create that second file. You remember from my flowchart, I had two files associated with this process. We had a login, and we had a login process.php. And we're also going to have a page that's only visible to registered users. So while I'm at it, I'm going to create a third page, and I'll call it authenticated user page.php. So I've gone ahead and I've created my three files here. Now let's start populating it. So first off, we'll start with this one, and I am going to add the HTML to make this into a nice form. So first off, we need to add our form elements. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because by now this should be review. I'm going to set the method to be post because I don't want these passwords being sent over the URL. And I'm going to set the action to go to that processing script, which I called login-process.php. Okay, so that's all we need there. Now this form is not going to be aesthetically pleasing. For your actual project, I want it to be in the look and feel of your website, but for now we're just doing a vanilla form. I'm going to need to collect the username, and I am going to need to collect the password, and I am going to need to have a submit button. So we'll do input type equals submit, and I want to change the default text of that button. So instead of reading submit, I want it to say login. So I'm going to add a value attribute, and I'm going to change this to say login. And now we need to add our actual input fields for username and password. For username, I'm just going to use an input with the type of text, and I need to give it a name so that I can access it later on in PHP. So let's just call it the same as we've called it in the database for consistency. No reason to make it different. And I'm going to close out of that element. So this will collect our username. Next, I need a field for our password. So let's go ahead and do an input. Now, instead of giving it an input type of text, I am going to give it a special type, an input type of password. Now, it's going to behave exactly the same way this text does once we submit it, but when we're typing in it, it's going to display those stars or dots instead of actually showing your password. So that way, if people are walking by and looking at your screen, they can't see your password written out in that field. And we're going to call this, once again, the same as we've called it in our database. We're going to call it password. And let's close out of this element. And let's take a quick peek at it just to make sure everything looks okay. Let's give it a title for now, too. Save it. Now this automatically is uploaded because I'm using that CyberDuck program. I'm going to go to modular site, and I called it /login.php. And you'll notice here is our login form. And when I click login, we're now hitting this login-process.php. And as you should probably expect, nothing's happening yet because this is still a blank file. What we need to do next is to start adding some of our work that's going to do the processing and the database calls. So the first thing we need to do in our processing script would be to fetch the values that we fed into it from the form. Once again, this should be review, but I'm going to fetch the username, and I want to fetch the password. And to use that, we need to use that special variable called post. And within the quotes, I want to put in the name of the field I'm fetching that corresponds with the name I gave it in the form. So in this case, I'm going to use username. And in this case, I am going to use password for the password. Now, so this video doesn't turn out to be 3 hours long. I'm leaving out the step of that additional checking that I want you guys to do. I mentioned I wanted you to check to make sure these variables have actually been submitted and that they're not blank. And I've shown you that in some of the previous videos, and I'll probably upload another video later this week showing you just how to do that portion of it. For now, this is something we would never want to do in the real world, but we're just going to assume the user is providing clean data, and they're not trying to hack into it. They're not trying to manipulate the code in any way. We're going to fetch the username and the password. Next, what we want to do is we want to check this username and password to make sure it matches what we have stored in the database. So that means we need to connect to our database. Now, if you watched the video I posted earlier, we moved this database connect code into an include. So depending on if you've done that, you might just need to do this include, or you might need to just copy the whole string for now. So don't do it this way if you can avoid it. Set up that include, but for now, just so you guys can see the full package, I'm going to paste in our code. This is the code, once again, that connects to our database. So this does the connection. This prints out any errors. And one thing I've forgotten to do is I forgot to add our opening PHP statement. That's why nothing was highlighted correctly. So I've gone ahead, I've added that. And while I'm at it at the bottom, I'll close out a PHP. So we've now created our database connection. The next step we would want to do is we want to fetch the password associated with the username that the person is submitting. So in this example, let's print out the username that the person is trying to log in as. So I'm going to go back to my form here, and I'm going to try to log in as JXTADM. And when I hit login, you'll see this is printing out JXTADM. So that's the person I want to fetch the correct password from for the database. We don't care about what another user's password is. We only want to know what JXT-ADM's actual password is. So I can build a database query that's going to fetch JXT-ADM and all of their subsequent information. Now, since this isn't a database class, I've allowed you guys and I've encouraged you guys to get your SQL that you need from phpMyAdmin. And in this case, I want to fetch a username with the ID JXT-ADM. So I am going to open our table, make sure we have it selected, and I'm going to click search. And I want to find a username with JXT-ADM. So I'm going to click OK. And you'll see this returns one result. And it also provides me with this SQL code here. And even if we don't understand SQL, I think we can kind of get the gist of it. We're selecting data, so we're pulling data. In this case, we're pulling all the fields because we have the star. We're pulling it from the table travel site users, and the conditions that we want to pull the username are if or where the username is like JXT-ADM. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this query, and I am going to, as what we've done before, in pretty much every example I followed the same pattern. I've created a query string, and I'm pasting in this query that I have now proven that works. But the only problem is that we've now hard-coded in this username JXT-ADM. But we want to actually query it based upon the username that the user provides. So what I'm going to need to do to fix this query is I'm going to want to feed this variable into our query. And hopefully this part's a review, but I need to escape the string, and I need to add a variable here, and now I can echo out the username. And as I mentioned, what I like to do before I actually try to run this in PHP, we can do some debugging. We could do our die command, and we could print out the value or what the SQL is turning into. So I'm just echoing out the value of the query. So now when I go back and I submit our form, you'll see this is the query that it's going to try to run. So for example, now if I were to change this to BDA-ADM, you'll see now the text inside our string has changed to be like BDA-ADM. And what I can do, I can actually copy and paste this just to make sure it's actually working in MySQL. I'm going to go back into phpMyAdmin, and I'm going to select the SQL tab, and I'm going to paste this code in, and we'll see that it's now working. It's returning one result. But if, for example, I were to try it with, let's say, this BDA-ADM, it's not going to work, I assume, because we have not created a user yet with that username. So in this case, it's going to return an empty result. So if this were the case, we would probably want to display an error saying, oh, we couldn't even find your username. We can't log you in. So this is going to be the sort of error detection we need. Like I said, I'm starting simple here. So we have our query. We know it's somewhat working here. Now let's go ahead and execute the query. Once again, we can use that same line of code that we used in our modular site and we used in our comment system. We are going to use this line here that looked something like this. We said result equals MySQLi query or die. So I'm just going to copy this. Let's zoom out a little bit and paste this in here. So this result is going to come from executing this query. We've provided it a link which corresponds to this link variable name, and we're providing it the query here. So we've given it the two parameters it needs. So now hopefully we've fetched JXT-ADM. Next we would want to do our while loop, and once again I can copy the code that I've done beforehand. Normally I don't like doing all this copying and pasting, but if you guys have been following along, we should already be familiar with this syntax. This relates, this I'm going to pull out of here. Now right now these are the fields from our content. It's title, alias, and text. We're using this code, but we're going to need to modify it to suit our needs. We don't want to pull in the title or the text. We instead want to pull the username from the database. So we want to pull in the person's password. We want to get this password and we want to see if it matches what the user has provided. So I'm going to take out these, and the only variable I need to fetch in this case to do my checking is going to be the password. And I'm going to say password is equal to row password. This while loop is going to execute depending on how many people we return, and ideally we should only be fetching one person because only one person should have the same username. But I can also verify that by doing this limit 1. I'm just going to add that to the end of my SQL query. So this will now pull the password for this one user, and let's verify that it's pulling the password. We're going to use our friend the die command here, and we are going to copy this here, paste this into here. Let's go back to our example, and I forgot, let's see, let's go back here and let's provide a password. So I'm going to do that temp pwd, and you'll see it's now printing out this password. So this is not the password that the user just provided here as a reminder. This is the password that's coming from the database that we already ran through this MD5. So you might now be thinking, hopefully, if you're thinking ahead a little bit, well, how do we verify that these are the same? We have one password that looks like this, and then we have the password that the user is submitting that looks more like this. Let's echo out this password. One thing, I made a slight mistake here. What I really wanted to do is I wanted to name this variable something different, because I want to have two different variables. I want to have a password for the password they've sent in, and I want to have a password for what we fetch in MySQL. So let's call this instead, this is going to be called password from, this is not a great name, but password from database, just so you guys see it, versus this variable here is just going to be called password. Hopefully it doesn't give me an issue with the hyphen in it. Let's see if it does. So first I want to echo out the password from the database, and then below that I want to echo out their password that they've provided from the form. And let's see if this works. Yeah, so I have a mistake here. Let's go back, and we forgot to put a semicolon here on line 24. Let's go here and refresh. And it looks like it probably isn't going to like the way I declared my variable. So it's saying there's an error on line 1. So let's just do let's do that camel case. I apologize for this. Been a kind of a long day of getting these demos ready. We're going to call this password from database, and we're going to say password from database. And let's refresh here, and now it should be working. So we have two passwords being shown here. One is the hash password, and one is this string password that we've put in here. So I'm just going to do test. Now it's saying test. So how do we compare these two? This is where we now need to hash or MD5 the password that the user has now given. And it's very easy to do in PHP. We just need to simply use a method called MD5. And in the parentheses, we put in the value that we want to hash. So in this case, I want to hash my password. So I'm going to put the password in there, and let's go ahead and echo this out. And let me go back a step here. I'm going to do JXT-ADM, and we'll do TEMP-PWD. And now you'll see both of the passwords look the same. Versus, let's just try doing test again, TEST. You'll see now these hashes look different. So we've proven that we can use this MD5 to get the same password. Now all we need to do is a simple if statement. We basically want to take these two variables and see if they match. So we want to say if the password from the database, which we get from the SQL and on this line, if this is equal to the password that we've provided from the form that we've just MD5'd, then they are authenticated. I'll say valid user. Else we are going to assume they are an invalid user. And let's go ahead and try this one more time. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to type our password correctly. So TEMP-PWD. And now it's saying here valid user. Let me take out this debugging here. So I've now refreshed and it says valid user. But now let's just type in some gibberish for the password. I'm not typing in the correct password here. Click enter, and now it says invalid user. So I think this just shows you the basic gist of it. We want a lot more error detecting here. We wouldn't even want to allow a person to attempt to submit with an empty password. But that's embellishments that we're going to need to add in later. So we've added that basic password detection here, and we've been able to check it once. Now you know when you use the web, we go visit multiple pages. So for example, I'm on the main page of YouTube, and now I go back to the home page. We need a way to be able to memorize if the user is logged in or not logged in between multiple pages. We don't want to have to run that database query every single time, and obviously we don't want to make our user have to sign in every single time a page loads. So what we are going to do here is we're going to use a very simple session variable to memorize the state of if the user is logged in or not. And I prepared a quick demo here. I know this is a lot to cover in one lecture. We could probably spend a week just on sessions. But just to give you guys a quick overview of how sessions work, you'll see I've created two pages here. I've created page 1 and page 2. And my goal is to create a variable in page 1, set a variable, and then I'd like to go to page 2, and I'd like that variable to persist. I'd like it to carry over to page 2. And I don't want to have to rely on passing it over with this get or post. We've done that before with forms, but I don't want to rely on that in this example. So let's go ahead and open up page 1, and I am going to create a session variable called is signed in, something like that. Now to first declare a session, we need to open our PHP and we need to start the session engine. Now there's a command or a method built into PHP. It's very simple. It's just going to be session_start. We don't really need to feed it any parameters at the moment. This will start the session. Next we want to create a session variable called is signed in. I called it something different in the example code I put out there. But how do I do this? I can't just do this. If I just were to do is signed in, and I were to echo here something like yes. If I now went to my page 2, this will not carry over. So let's go in, let's do page 2, and let's try echoing out this value. As you probably are expecting, it is not going to carry over. And we can verify that if we want by just popping this open. We're going to go to modular site. We're going to do page1.php. We set it here, and now we're going to go to page 2, and you'll see that it is not set. So how do we get a variable to stay set between these two pages? This is the dilemma, and this will also solve our problem of maintaining the state if a user signed in without having to query the database every single time. So we need to set this to be a session variable. So we can do that easily. It's just one line of PHP. We're going to do a declaration that looks sort of like our get and post. This is going to look similar. We do our $sign and we do our underscore, and then instead of typing get or post, we type session. Now in between these two quotes, we want to put in the name of the variable we want to create. So in this case, I want to create a variable called isSignedIn, and now we are going to set this to be equal to yes. And I can go ahead and echo this out just to verify it's set. I'm going to do echo, and instead of adding an equal sign, I just want to echo it like this, similar to how we would echo our get and post values. And I'm going to click save. So now when I refresh, you'll see this is printing out as yes. But now we want that value to carry over to page 2. So let's open up our page 2 in brackets, and you'll see that this is the code that we used to echo it out, and it worked. On line 6, this echoed out yes. But now let's try just moving this in to line 3 here. And now this should work too. The key here is that I started the session. We have to remember to always set the session. So let's go ahead and save this, and now let's refresh page 2, and now you'll see that this yes now exists on both page 1 and page 2. Here's page 2. But for example, if I had forgotten this on line 2, we would then get an error. So we have to remember that on every page we want to use a session variable, we have to include the session start at least once. So I'll put some code out there on sessions, but it's a very basic variable that we're going to set. And that way we can have this variable stored once they go through here. What we want to do is we want to add a session variable here saying, yes, they are a valid user. So we can take the code we used here. We want to copy I'm going to paste these 2 lines inside of our processing page. We want to keep our session start outside of the loop, or outside of the if statement. And I am now going to add a session variable inside of the if statement. So if they successfully signed in, I'm going to set this, instead of setting it to yes, I'm going to use a boolean, so like a true or a false. I'm going to set it is signed in true. And if they aren't signed in, we are going to set it to be false. So now that we've declared these variables, oops, let me change this to false. We can then make another if statement that we can use on other pages to check to see if they're signed in or not. I'm going to go ahead and just build the if statement right here, and then we can go try that out on another page. We'll try it out on this page 1 and page 2. Let's just see if it carries over. So the first thing I want to check to see is if the first thing we probably want to make sure is to make sure this thing is actually even set, because if they haven't logged into the page yet, this would throw up a notice. It wouldn't necessarily be an error, but it would be one of those boxes, and it would look kind of weird to see a notice in our final project. So I'm going to say if is set, and I want to check if this session variable is set, and if it's set, is this session variable equal to true? Or if it's true, I can actually just keep it like this. If I wanted to say not signed in, I could put an exclamation point. So this is kind of similar to maybe what we did in Java, but I'm going to say, so if they're signed in and this is true, then we can say echo I am signed in, show the private content. Or I can display some sort of error message saying here, since not signed in. And this eventually we should be able to move into our other files as long as we include the session start. Let's just go ahead and refresh here. I'm going to go back to login. We need to actually execute this one so that that session variable can store. And I'm just going to put in a gibberish password for now. And now we are getting that not signed in error. And now we can verify that this session is actually carrying from page to page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this line, these 3 lines, and I am going to now paste that and replace what we had in page 1. Now notice I'm keeping the session start up here. If I took this out, it would no longer work. So I'm going to keep this here. I'm going to put this if statement down below. And now we're going to manually type in /page1.php. And as you'll see, we're getting that not signed in error pages here. So now we've verified that that is now carrying from page to page. Another thing we might want to do is once we finish signing in, maybe we want to take them to a specific page. So in this case, what I want to do is once they've signed in that login process, I want to take them to page1.php, where I've displayed this message. So let's go ahead and go back to our code, and I'm going to go back to login process. And instead of displaying the message here, I want to immediately send them to another page. So I'm going to do the command, it's known as header. Now I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but notice, just remember this is how it's going to look. We do a header, and inside the header we have to put a string, and we're going to say location : page1.php. This works because we're in the same folder and everything. So this is how you create a very simple redirect in PHP. So they're going to hit this process and then end up at page 1. So if all goes as planned here, let's go back to login.php. I'm going to try to log in with the wrong credentials. Now it's taken me to page 1 and it says not signed in. But now let's try going back, and we're going to try signing in again, this time with the correct credentials. We're going to use that temporary password. We're going to sign in, and now it's saying I am signed in, so show the private content. So if you were building a page where you had private content, in this case I'm building this on page 1, you would want to put all your private content in between this if statement, depending on how you had it structured. And this could be the error. So this is where you could put some of your features that you don't want any guest to be able to see. So going into the final assignment, which I'm going to provide some details on, that's going to be an addition to your final project. There's going to be a final assignment that takes the place of your practical or final exam. And in that, you're going to need to sign in and be able to delete comments. It's going to be a fairly basic setup. I'm not making you edit and do sorts of other things, but you're going to need to sign in and do a basic delete, which I'll cover next week. So this stuff is going to be important for your final assignment, and more will be coming about that shortly.